Big Safety Podcast with Vance and Bart.
It's a trap. There's no comfort fitting in a fake safety that no one believes in.
So remember back in the early 2000s when we kind of uncovered the 9/11 bait and switch, and everyone was like, Bush lied, people died. Really easy sort of chant.
In the Empire, bumper stickers were everywhere. They didn't really stick with that one, did they?
No, that one didn't. That one didn't hold up nearly as well. But the Bush lied, people died thing went for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting to have him as the, first politician who's famously lied. But I guess it's been that long since someone has, but it seems recently we've been talking about it a bit with our dear Dr. Fauci, who has now lied to Congress.
Yeah. First off, I'd like to bring up the reason why American politicians don't lie is because of the cherry tree.
Right.
Right.
They cannot tell a lie.
Right.
Physically,
yes. So, the example of the great cherry tree president, they have decided to be honest with us until recently, just recently. They have started becoming less truthful, I think.
Right. And that's what I wanted to get a little bit into here is we're noticing that Fauci has lied to Congress, right?
Oh,
and
I hope you have evidence, not just stating something that's that outlandish. And
no, luckily, when a guy like that talks and Congress listens, there's usually a lot of documentation.
Okay, I'm with you so far.
So what comes of that? Right? Like we can talk about, the point you made is that we often get caught up in, allegedly, or did they actually lie? Like we know that they lied, but is it something? But this is on the record. What happens to?
Well, I guess first off, if you're just somebody from the outside looking in, not somebody who is up to speed on what the state really is, I would think you would say, okay, well, how big was their lie? How did it affect the people? And is it really worth going through all the trouble of bringing charges against this person? Whatnot? For example, his lie, he just funded the research of a virus that got out and shut down the world and caused the suicide rates to go up, billions and billions of dollars to be lost, probably the economic crash of a lifetime to happen. So, is it really worth prosecuting him or what? Right? No, of course not. Why would it be? The state gave him the money to do that. They wanted him to do that. Do you think that him lying to a bunch of congressmen who were fine with giving him the money and funding the fucking research to begin with? Do you think we give them an out by letting them use him as a scapegoat? Do I think that he deserves to burn in hell? Absolutely. But I don't think that the Congress, the government that gave him the money to do that, has any right to judge him for doing that or lying to them. The same people who told him to do it, he's lying to about it. So they know he's lying. He knows they know he's lying. It's a dance.
So it being documented, you're saying is maybe even part of the plan, right? Like they know he's lying, and if he gets to a place where he's caught lying, it won't matter because
Changes
not-
nothing.
but following it all the way down, I think a lot of that rests on the American people. I think a lot of people being complacent allows for the government to behave that way.
Mhm.
So if the American people are up in arms, so let's say we get to a place where we are all in alignment and we can all agree that Fauci lied and there's like a clear shift
Okay.
in sentiment, what happens to him?
For the most part, they would probably just put him in a prison, a cushy prison, until people moved on to the next thing in the news cycle that happens about 30 minutes after that. And then they just let him go. Worst case scenario for him, best case scenario for me, he gets murdered in prison. So he didn't say anything. Because he's not going to say anything that outs anybody because they'll kill him before that happens. So that's not an option. I mean, him being murdered, kind of. I mean, I don't have any sympathy for that. But what should happen is not just him go down, but the whole system go down for doing this. They all allowed it. It's if we say he does get killed, it doesn't change anything because tomorrow it's still going on. I mean, we were talking earlier about they killed Jeffrey Epstein in the prison, right? Or he didn't get killed and he's out, whatever. But I'm pretty sure I think, have no evidence. There's just a lot of circumstantial evidence, but
Right. Of the
yeah.
likely situations, right? Like it's an interesting one because the conspiracy theory would be that he got let go and he's somewhere else and that was like a body double or whatever.
Right.
Whereas the truth, as everyone accepts it, is that he was murdered.
Right. And so, like we were saying, I guarantee you that there was not a skip in the beat of the CIA program of honeypotting people they want to have influence over with underage children to sleep with. I don't think that program was stifled, slowed down in the slightest. Because think about it. We need a pedo. We're going to give them billions of dollars in free mansions and shit like that, right? Set them up for life. All we need is a pedo. I mean, how hard is that to find? There's tons of YouTube, apparently very popular YouTubers. That's what they do. They call out pedos on their YouTube channel.
Wait,
they honeypot. They bait them and then they go like Chris Hansen used to.
Oh,
but
okay.
without the cops, they just like, I'm going to release this footage unless you call your wife right now and tell her what you did and things like that. There's a lot of YouTubers that do that right now. Except the state would be like, here's the kid to actually have sex with. And would you like a couple mansions and a lot of fucking money and have a lot of friends who like to fuck children too? I mean, that guy's like, fuck yeah. And then the system keeps going. And how long do you think it took them to replace that motherfucker? That's why he's dead, I think. Instead of being like relocated. Because he was easily replaceable. There's a lot of fucking pedos out there.
Yeah, order of operations, we like to think that they murdered him and we're like, well, okay, let's find another one. But I have to imagine it was more a case of he's getting too hot, or maybe even before that, like,
Right.
Let's make sure we have a couple of, there's like a minor league.
Yeah, it's not like he hadn't been caught a few years back and then the story was squat. I remember it. And I'm like, whatever happened to that with Bill Clinton and the plane and the underage hookers and stuff? It was when he got caught the first time. And the judge was like, here's some probation. And because he got told what to do. And he said, I was told by intelligence agencies to, that this needed to be the punishment. He came out about that later, after the fact.
Yeah, not great timing on that.
Yeah. But I mean, I imagine he was hot then. They're like, okay, well, if this goes too far, if the news doesn't just let it go, like we've told them to, or if people catch up on it and say, hey, why didn't you continue? If it would have been a Bush, or at that time, a Bush, or, or no, at that time, if it had been a Trump, anybody that knew Trump, they couldn't have saved him the first, the first run. But a Clinton, people don't want to know that Clinton's fucking kids, or raping women in hotel rooms, many women who've come out about it. And they don't want to believe that Hillary Clinton's killing tons of people or having them killed. But
yeah, I mean, the blood's not on her hands. Let's be real. She's not doing the dirty work.
I kind of think that she would be like, hold him. I'm going to do it. I kind of feel like she would do that. I've heard stories about the way that she's grabbed people physically and said things into their ears to warn them to not move forward with these rape allegations against her husband or whatever. I think that she would absolutely love to be one of the like somebody who did something, hold him down. I'm going to inject it into his vein or something. But
so somebody else cleans up. She's not
going to do the work. She can hardly walk with those big ankles. Like
cankles.
Yeah, right.
I don't want this to be a body shaming podcast,
but a body count podcast. We're good with that, right?
Some of my best friends are cankles.
Yeah. So the state and Fauci, let's get back to him. It's a joke because he works for the state. He's the highest paid person for the state, and he's doing what the state wants him to do and has been with AIDS, with the COVID-19 virus, both of those. He is working for the state, for Big Pharma, who participates in the state through FDA, through financing certain politicians to get their drugs, certain Big Pharma companies' drugs through and not others, keep out competition, whatnot, what have you. He works for those people, that group of, let's call it crony capitalism. Yeah. What turns into fascism later, which I would tend to say we're there now. We've crossed that line. But to take him down and just have him as a fall guy and then forget about it is exactly what the reason why they would let us take him down. Because
they've already got a rookie waiting in the wings, a la whoever.
They have to, because that girl who works for the CDC that's pulling the weight now. I imagine she's in because Fauci's old as shit. They got to be counting on it, right?
Well, it's like the first time they let Epstein go, right? Like there's the fact that we know his name now means that there's another guy somewhere whose name we do not know yet.
Right. And then it's not like the state hasn't been killing people a long time.
Well, this is the second time someone in politics has lied. I thought I opened with that.
Right. They just didn't talk about the other times, right? Nobody ever asked questions about Agent Orange. Nobody asked questions about that, right? How about Sherman going through the South?
So Agent Orange is an interesting one because much like I know the sentiment around Epstein. Like pretty much everybody in America is like, oh, he didn't kill himself, he was murdered. And then the conspiracy theory is like well beyond that. So the truth is closer to what would be a conspiracy theory. But
Yeah.
there's no like, we haven't yet seen a declassified document saying that, right? Whereas Agent Orange, that's not a conspiracy theory.
Right. It's not a theory, it's a conspiracy. Because, yes, there has been enough evidence released. Sure, not all of it, but enough that without a shadow of a doubt, we can say that that chemical caused the death and illness of many U.S. agents, U.S. troops, U.S. citizens, and many foreign citizens who didn't need to be killed, who weren't part of the government we were fighting against. Let's not forget that people who live in a different country, whose government decides to fight with our government, for whichever government is wrong in the situation, it doesn't really matter. They're just people who live there, just like innocent Americans are people who live somewhere. And we caused the death. We caused birth defects, miscarriages, so death that didn't need to happen of an entire life at that point. Like, if the birth would have went through and that baby would have been able to survive, like, that's an entire that's more than killing somebody who's 16, because you took the entire life away from that.
There are quite a few potential years being racked up there. Absolutely.
Right. And that's awful. And that's something that we did and that we've declassified, and nobody seems to give a fuck about it. Or I say nobody. People in our circles seem to give a fuck about it. But I mean, at least there's somebody giving a fuck, I guess. But
well, comedy is tragedy plus time. So I don't think any of this is comedic just yet, but it has moved out of the realm of tragedy. These are folks who died or had birth defects and things like that, and are now generations away from the people who are looking into it. So the people closest to it don't get their vindication. It's a generation or two later that gets it.
And that's why it was released, because they knew the outrage just wouldn't be there.
Well, I think there's an interesting air gap almost between, let's say, even some of the most recent things that have been declassified, stuff that happened in like the 70s and 80s, which people like us and people who are listening to this are old enough to have been alive then. So it's still somewhat recent memory, but somehow it's just long enough ago that people believe incorrectly that something happened since then to make the state more accountable and more transparent.
Right. Yeah. And then, but you go back and watch it, the ones you're talking about, the Wacos, the Ruby Ridge and whatnot, and you see the same politicians, the ones that are on the stage today, giving you the God's honest truth about the investigation that they've been a part of, are the same motherfuckers who were doing the lies on the ones back then. It's just a lot fucking older.
That in itself, I think, is an interesting study. The idea that the average age of a politician at that time was not 90.
Yeah.
And sure, some of that has to come down to life expectancy and how folks live longer and things like that. But the positions of power, people hold on to them until death now. There's no passing of the torch.
Right. I remember, I recently went into a Waco thing, like a revamp of the research on that. And I saw a politician that was accused of rape and then I think stepped down and died. Very old politician, a champion of the Democrat side. up until, of course, the accusal of rape. But when I saw him lying about things that we know now are absolute lies, and his fake passion about it, it looked exactly like the fake passion that you see about the other stuff you see today. I did feel a little bit of content in the fact that I know he's dead now, I must say. Just like any time that I see John McCain try to hold his arms up and then he can't, I go, maybe it wasn't so bad they tortured him, because he's a piece of shit and he deserves to be tortured for the rest of eternity in hell. But a lot of these things that I go in to look at that are declassified now, that where the U.S. government has killed people, U.S. citizens, foreign citizens, innocent citizens of different places, just for experiment's sake. There's nobody that I can watch or remember that I can go, oh, it's like it's personal. Like, I'm glad that person's dead now or whatever. It's just the government. And that's more real than me being mad at John McCain, because it is just the government, because it happened before John McCain. It happened before Woodrow Wilson, even though like he's one of the worst. It happened before Lincoln, even though he was one of the worst. And I guarantee you, George Washington told a fucking lie.
Are you telling me that he didn't chop down the cherry tree?
I'm telling you, he did chop down that motherfucking cherry tree. And then he lied about it. And then somebody goes, oh, no, he didn't. When it came out. Oh, no, he didn't lie about it. No, you're remembering it wrong.
Chop down the cherry tree. That's fake news. I'm imagining him as like a little baby with like a big head running around.
Like the adult head.
Right.
Just
The
on a baby's body.
the adult George Washington, like on a quarter head, but on a baby's body.
Right.
That's how I imagine him. Because the cherry tree incident, as I'm sure it's known, was supposed to be when he was a kid, right?
Right.
I'm just imagining him as a little baby just running around calling everything fake news.
So then so what have we done? We've done Agent Orange. We've talked a little bit about Waco, not a lot, which we are going to get really in depth in a near episode. A little teaser for you guys. We're going to try to go through a lot of these things that we're mentioning today more in depth, but it's going to take a lot of research and a lot of dedication on our part. So you're going to have to be patient with us. We're not going to be able to do them in consecutive weeks, but we will get to all that we can possibly find information on. There's a town in France that I'd like to talk about where the Cold War was starting up. This is after World War II. And all of a sudden, the entire town went mad for multiple days. People were jumping out of windows. A child thought he was a dragonfly and basically committed suicide, but not on purpose because he thought he could fly, obviously. I believe an old man lit himself on fire for whatever reason. Who knows? And turns out the CIA was drugging unwilling people, not in America and in other places, U.S. citizens in other places around the world, with LSD against their knowledge or will. And turns out they did it to an entire town in France of French people who, for whatever reason, they did it to, whether it was an accidental drugging, which who knows, but it was done through apparently French people, at least back then, like the bread, the baguette or whatnot. And the town, unlike today with the advancements of capitalism and where it's got us to today. Back then, there wasn't a lot of different places to go and get your bread in France or whatever. So this town had a bakery. This baker was imprisoned for months. He was investigated nonstop, life threatened by his own citizens. He was a victim just like everybody else. Because they knew it had something to do with the bread, because of the people who got sick and the people who didn't. It became like a disease in wheat. They investigated. Turned out that didn't hold water.
Is this where the gluten-free thing came from?
Exactly. A lot of people think it was Chinese food restaurants, but it's not. It was French. The French did it with their French fries and whatnot.
Freedom fries.
Freedom fries. So we experimented on a bunch of innocent people, not just innocent. Our government, who we pay with our tax dollars because they don't make shit, experimented on people from another country who have nothing to do with our government. I know it's easy to get more outraged when they do it to U.S. citizens, because they're like, oh, we pay our taxes and stuff. These people don't want anything to do with it. They haven't asked anything to do with the United States. They haven't voted for shit here, and they're getting tested on. That shit happens all around the world today with the way that we try to manipulate elections here and get different rulers and over here and whatnot and what have you. Those people, they would be completely happy, I think, to not have to worry about what America is going to do tomorrow in their country. I think they would probably forgive us if we just leave them the fuck alone. Look at the goddamn Taliban. The goddamn Taliban is like, we will protect you if you just stop fucking with us. The Taliban. These aren't the nicest motherfuckers in the world. I can promise you that. They're not exactly good people, but they're like, damn it, America. You are out bad guying us. Please leave us the fuck alone. We will be nice to you. Just leave us alone.
So for those who aren't familiar with this French town, the town is Point Saint Esprit. But honestly, if you just DuckDuckGo, let's say like a LSD French village experiment, you can probably get through that pretty easily. But I think this kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier, is there's this idea that happened nearly a century ago. And we have this idea, especially given anything within the window of either of the world wars, right? That things were just a bit more barbaric.
Right.
Things were just a bit less cohesive. World governments were a bit more malicious. They were a bit less transparent than they are now.
Well, I would like to remind people who are thinking that way that we literally had a Nazi as president in the United States here. And we had Border Patrol riding horses with reins, which is worse, mind you, than slavery. So
what's her name? The
Maxine Waters.
Yeah.
I mean, thank God she was there, or at least somewhere around a microphone to make a speech about it.
Worse than slavery.
Yeah, literally. So we have all these things going on that are just as barbaric, mind you. And we are trying to save the world by, forcing people to take fluids into their body against their will. That way they're not considered a second-class citizen and put into concentration camps.
Quarantine
I mean,
camp. You
well,
mispronounced.
quarantine camps. I mean, us civilized people are trying to do that, unlike the barbaric Nazis who are just wanting people to not have to do that.
But if we got the barbaric Nazis out of office,
Mhm.
that wouldn't
But-
be happening now then.
Well, there's a threat of it happening because when they were getting out of office, one of them farted on Nancy Pelosi's chair. So we've imprisoned a bunch of them, thank God, without trial.
That is what counts as news right now, which is pretty fascinating, right? Because if you do think about these CIA experiments with LSD and things like that, that's so in depth and so complex that one would imagine that news now
Mhm.
would be even more in depth and have an even longer cycle
Mhm.
because there are even more threads to tease out. When in
Right, because
fact
they've
we've
been
gone,
taught. No,
But
well, have we really? Because they've been taught how to weed out these threads so well by the history that they're just doing it. They just naturally do it. That's why they get all the way to insurrection by fart on chair.
they've got a formula, is what you're saying.
Right. They're just really good at it now.
They're like, oh, I think I know an insurrection when I see one.
Right. So we've got Agent Orange and then to the French village. Then the US citizen, the unknowing people, the malaria experiments where no prisoners died. Right? That's the official number is no prisoners died that were subjected to malaria before World War II, mind you, because we were going to go into the Pacific and they wanted to investigate how to treat malaria because troops, especially troops who haven't been people who aren't from that region, have never had those viruses in their system before. Therefore, their bodies haven't developed a natural immunity, and which existed back then, mind you, but doesn't exist today.
I was curious, like, what does that mean? What is natural immunity?
Well, back in a long time ago, before Fauci, there
In the
was no
before times?
Fauci. Yeah, they didn't have vaccines, so our bodies had to come up with a different way to do it. But now that there's vaccines, our bodies stopped doing that because there's vaccines now.
We've
So-
evolved away from having that as a need.
Right. Yeah.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That checks out.
So what they did was they took people who were in prison and they made mosquitoes that had malaria in them bite these people. There's pictures of it. And then they would treat them different ways and to see which one worked out better and make sure nobody died, to figure out how to keep our troops from dying. Luckily, though, all their treatments worked really well and no prisoners died in the experiment.
Oh, okay. So
Well, it was a public experiment. They did not hide this experiment. This is one that we didn't have to get released. It was a public experiment where they convinced the population that these prisoners want to do this because they've messed up their lives and they want to help with the war effort in some way.
So none of them died,
Every one of them survived malaria.
which means that malaria is not nearly as deadly as we think it is, especially
Yeah.
when we use it as a comparison for the current vaccine conversation around how malaria is dangerous and
Mhm.
needs a vaccine because any treatment will work.
Well, I like to think that, like the vaccine that we have currently for COVID-19, the very first treatment that they tried, besides exploding people's lungs with
Ventilators.
respirators, yeah, worked perfectly because, experiments and learning that we are so perfect, and our food and big pharma is the best.
So they only tried one way to fix it. They only
I don't think so. Not with malaria. I think there was a lot of different treatments, but I think because we
all of
came
them
up with them, American doctors
Oh,
that
you
work
didn't
for
tell
the
me.
government,
Okay.
they were all amazing ideas.
See, you didn't tell me that. You didn't tell me these were American doctors.
Right. Well, they were American now. They might not have been American their whole lives, but they were American and they worked for America when they did it.
As long as it's an American company that's making the treatment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's intertwined with American government very much. So, in some aspect, it could be considered a national company. But I like to think that's because America has its fingers out everywhere, as opposed to
isn't everyone American when you really think about it?
Well, yeah, unless you want to die, because fuck you if you're not American, right? So,
yeah, who are we at war with then?
Americans, I think.
This is getting confusing.
It might be, but that's just because our beloved leaders haven't told us how to interpret it yet. So we'll figure it out later. Just wait for the next news cycle. What about the hippie movement, the LSD? I mean, obviously it was being introduced by CIA because there was only one producer of LSD at the time, and that was the United States government labs. So obviously the Grateful Dead were getting it from the CIA.
That seems to have played out a bit differently than the French Village.
Yeah, it was a little more recreational, right? I think it was more of a experiment to discredit the anti-war movement, because LSD was kind of failing as a mind control drug, but it was a very mind altering drug. And, you focused on just how great LSD is and forget about this over here. Right. But, whatever, who knows why they were doing it, but they were definitely doing it. And then where are we now? We have the water up in Flint, Michigan, right?
Right? Yes.
Right. So, Dasani water starts killing people. Nobody buys Dasani anymore. They go under whatever. It happens in Flint. The mayor's blaming this person blaming that person blaming that person. Nobody's fixing the fucking thing. People are dying, whatever. They're just blaming everybody, and nobody's responsible. And meanwhile, everybody's dying and everybody's going, oh, the government should do something. I think they're doing enough. I think they've done enough at this point. I think it's time for somebody else to do something.
Sounds like Dasani.
For fuck's sake, as much as I hate that big corporate shit, if the government wasn't in control of everything, there would be no reason for Coke or Pepsi or anybody to buy into the government anyway, and they would be a lot better company. But even at their most evil, where they're buying off politicians and shit like that, they're still better than the government. The only problem I have with them is because they control parts of the government.
Yeah, if there was nothing there for them to control, they would just have to,
make us happy as customers, or go under and give an opportunity for me to be Dasani with my bottling company.
So where are we with Flint water? I'm really awful with a sense of time. How long ago was that?
Uh, it feels like decades ago, but I don't think it was. It was during the Trump presidency, right? Yeah, earlier in it. Because when it like right after the stop, don't shoot thing.
I don't recall. But it's recent, right? And the solution was basically just to forget about it, right? 3 years ago, 3 years ago, we called the crisis over because we were just like, oh, well, let's just switch to a different city's water.
I don't know. I would imagine what happened was they probably took another county who's got a better treatment plant or one that can handle more.
I want to say it was Detroit, but
Yeah,
I
I bet they just diverted. They probably just diverted part of it there, and then are paying like a small fee to, have some of their fluids treated there. Which probably what's happening is Detroit's just dumping because the unknown fact of it is being somebody who grew up with a dad who owned a company who built water treatment plants. When you get overran, you have to dump a certain amount of water into the river, and you're allowed to dump a certain amount of waste into the river, right? But not over that amount. You get fined. That's what happened in Flint. They weren't allowed to dump any more than a certain amount, and they're just dumping the max all the time. So they're not using it as a extra. They're always at the max. So any extra amount of water it's just not getting processed correctly, right? So
it's meant to be an overage allowance,
right,
for worst case scenario, as opposed to an ongoing allowance. So
that's correct.
It's meant to be a deterrent in the way that most people, except for the incredibly wealthy, would consider a speeding ticket something that would be a worst case scenario for speeding or something. But I'd have to imagine if you're a billionaire, $300 speeding ticket is just the cost of doing business.
Right. But if you're a low income person, it's definitely different for you. You can imagine that maybe somebody who now can't get a job as easily, who's already had trouble getting a job and never really made that much, it's more of a problem for them than it is for somebody who's, independently wealthy or made a lot of money to say, oh, I gotta not have a job for a little bit while I shop around because I gotta find somebody who will hire me even though I don't have the vaccine. Whereas somebody who is less wealthy might have to accept being raped by the state and, introduce fluids into their body that they're not really willing to have just to have a job.
So what I'm gathering is there are a lot of individuals at play, and a government is a body of people. It doesn't exist without people. You take the people out, it doesn't exist because it's just them propagating that. But it is bigger than that.
But if you change the people out, it still exists.
Because it's an idea, right?
Yes, it's a established power. It doesn't matter who we vote into office. The fact that the office still exists is the problem. For all you people who love Trump, the problem with Trump is he used that power to get things done that you may agree with instead of eliminating the power working to eliminate the power. That's the real problem.
And for the folks on the left, would we want to give Trump, who will ultimately run again in 2024, if he is then elected, do we want to give him the ability to decide what injection we take?
He'll obviously use that power. He's not willing to get rid of the power. So, America, wake up.
Grab a brush and put a little makeup?
Hide the scars to fade away the shakeup.
It's a trap. There's no